Okay, we're going to deal with a few topics that have to do with politically charged entertainment kind of failing. And I think this is kind of a bit of a step away, although not entirely, from the election talk and some, of course, there's the Rosenstein thing, which I think I'll cover that tonight technically, when, I get a little more information. I've been a bit out of the loop. But I can talk a lot about the cultural rot that has to do with politicizing nearly all forms of entertainment since well before the Trump era, by the way. And I'll explain it this way, okay? A lot of the successful shows in entertainment, whether it's music, whether it's if you want to go see a play, I don't, but let's say you do. If you want to go see a baseball game, it depends on bringing to the audience something that looks organic and something that presents to people just a pure representation of the form that is headlining. That's all you have to say. What would you want somebody before every pitch basically saying, well, I am throwing this curveball in the name of saving the polar ice caps? I don't think so. So obviously I'm using an extreme example. There are, of course, baseball players, that have had civic messages, and they could come in all sorts of forms. Kurt Schilling on the right, and then there's I think what's the guy's name? Was it Madison Bumgarner on the Giants? I'm not entirely not. No, it wasn't him. There was a pitcher a few years ago. But in any case, what I'm trying to say is that when you make entertainment so political that people can't stand it anymore, you get kind of a saturation. And people are dealing in the past few days with the bombing of Fahrenheit 11/9, which is Michael Moore's sequel to Fahrenheit 9/11. And I think that those of us that have followed Moore's career have, we can kind of see that this is the logical conclusion to it. Now, I want to say, first of all, that I think the only Moore film that I've seen most of, and I wouldn't even say I've seen all of it, was Bowling for Columbine. I saw a bit of Sicko as well, and Roger and Me. I saw some of. Oh, and of course Canadian Bacon, which ironically is the only film of his that isn't a documentary. And the reason I've personally never been a fan of Michael Moore, is because this is a person who does not really do documentaries. This is not documentary filmmaking. It's really more kind of, long polemics in the name of a certain agenda that he does in film form, okay? And the reason that it's failing nowadays is because, unfortunately, he's a victim of his own success. You see, Michael Moore, when he had, Bowling for Columbine won an Oscar, that of course was kind of him breaking into, almost the mainstream at the time. Then he had Fahrenheit 9/11, which was, of course, him basically putting lightning in a bottle and claim, of course, he made political documentaries as a whole. He proved that they could be profitable. He had an opening, this is from the Hollywood Reporter, of $23.9 million at the cinema in 2004, which for a documentary was a lot of money. It was a lot of money if you consider it a documentary. Now, the fact is, and I'm of course, I don't like George Bush, but Fahrenheit 9/11 was simply not an accurate portrayal. For one thing, I remember the one criticism that I remember seeing of it was that they claimed that his decision to go into Afghanistan was because of a certain pipeline that his family and Halliburton were backing, and that and they kind of ignored the fact that the pipeline that got built was through a rival firm that I think Unocal what was the main partner in it, who was one of the partners in that? It was President Clinton. It was President Clinton. And yes, there are numerous issues with George Bush and his connection to the Saudis that I think are worthy of examination. I don't think that Fahrenheit 9/11 does that with real accuracy, and I think that Moore doesn't even claim to do. Michael Moore is basically a partisan operative. That's the fact of the matter. Okay, you cannot look. We are never going to have, unfortunately, the way the country is, a good type of, a good authority who's able to go in and look at political issues and show, to the approval of a consensus of Americans what the real problem is. And I think Moore is one of the reasons for that. But yes, he created. I was watching Styx's take on this too, and I'm going to watch Tim Pool's as well. There's a real issue with, again, him having a runaway success that could not be reproduced, and that's the fact that Moore and other people like Morgan Spurlock, they created this craze of new, I would say insurgent documentary filmmakers that were basically saying, yes, we're going to cut through the crap. We're going to show people for what they really are. And, unfortunately, those people kind of sold out. Michael Moore is not somebody who's averse to appearing on network TV, on cable TV, and pimping his shit basically to a corporate audience. And that's really the downfall. You see, I don't know if you guys remember, but there used to be a time when Green Day, the band, was considered punk. And very early on, very, very early on, and I remember watching their Behind the Music on VH1 special, which in and of itself, by the very fact that they had one, it shows that they're not punk. They began to say, well, we don't give a fuck if people think we're punk or not. Well, then what do we call your music then? Once your music has kind of departed from its original message and from its original audience, then you are something else entirely. And that happened with Green Day. They really jumped the shark in terms of that. Nowadays, they're just as commercial as any other band. The same thing with Michael Moore. The same thing with other genres that are kind of living in kind of, a late stage cancer, you could say, dying from their own success. Okay, they are based, and by the way, when I say that, I mean that their best days are way, way behind them. And Michael Moore is in his 60s. Okay, he's no longer the big new voice that he was back in the 80s and 90s when, of course, the film that really showed him, how he could take on big corporate America was Roger and Me, where he took on Big Auto, GM, claiming that they were robbing Detroit, they were taking jobs away. Those are the types of films that people could really, really relate to, even though in truth there were inaccuracies in that film as well. Let's not, let GM off the hook for things that they've done wrong. But Michael Moore has betrayed the actual message of not the message, but the actual principles of journalism over and over and over again throughout his entire career. And people started to notice it. There were several documentaries made in response to Michael Moore. The best of which, and I haven't seen Larry Elder's, which is, I don't know if Larry Elder could make a good film. I think he's more of a radio person. But there was a crew of Canadians that made a film called Manufacturing Dissent. And these were liberal Canadians who were not for the war, and they were not for George Bush, and they followed him around. And they started to notice that really Michael Moore might be, shaping minds and getting people to listen to him. But in reality, he is basically the archetypical fraud limousine liberal, and what today, after the 2016 election, many progressives call a sheepdogger, because during the 2004 election, he was basically shaming Ralph Nader voters. I think he'd already been calling them names during the 2000 election, and you know what? I think that basically his behavior right now kind of illustrates that he hasn't changed as a person. He's basically as unapologetically partisan as he always was, and in many ways that's worse for the Democrats. It's worse for the Democrats this way, and I'll tell you why. Michael Moore does not swing votes to either side. Okay, if you're a confirmed Democrat, Michael Moore's material is usually will make you feel comfortable in your own skin, and you don't really feel like you have to change anything that you're thinking, because it's always portraying the evil, greedy white male Republicans as the villains or whatever, and it ignores certain changes that have gone on in the American right over the past 15 years, 16 years, however long it's been. Let's say since 1999, the American right has changed a lot. It's no longer this group of country club millionaires and billionaires. There is some diversity on the American right. I'm not going to say it's really the picture of diversity, but there's a lot of different types of people who believe in reducing the size of government and school choice, of course, and in repealing Obamacare, maybe doing entitlement reform to a greater degree, and of course there's less interventionism on the right now than there used to be, and there's more interventionism on the left. So if anything, Michael Moore, listen to that. Michael Moore, if he really has an objection to war, he should be criticizing the Democrats a lot more. It doesn't mean that he should support the Republicans at all, but he should be criticizing the Democrats a lot more. The Democrats, after all, are the ones who are blaming literally everything on Russia. It's the Democrats who pretty much, they vote for every military spending bill that there is. It's true. Even if, some people on the far left of the Democratic Party, they exaggerate those spending hikes. Okay, but it's still correct that there are spending hikes, and the Democrats keep voting for them. So I think that's an important point to make. And there's other issues where you can see that Moore is moving in parallel to other kind of suffering forms of entertainment / news / TV. There's the Emmys that have continued to just lose viewers, just like all the award shows. What's the issue here? Well, I'll tell you what the issue is. It used to be that people had a fairly limited number of shows that they would watch. Okay, there were only a certain number of networks that were on, and most people could relate to the shows that were being nominated. Nowadays, the variety has hit the Emmys and other awards shows very hard, such that when you put on like an award show that is 5 or 6 hours long, you have all these idiots dressed up in tuxes and pretending that they're very funny. You don't even know. There's a fair chance you don't even know who the fuck these comedians are. You would have on many of these award shows, especially like the Oscars. For many years, you have. I know that Chris Rock has hosted the Oscars more than once. Now you're having people who are not necessarily known comedians. I think this is Michael Che and this other guy, who they're on SNL. There's a much smaller share of people who watch SNL now than there was in the past. Let's look at that SNL ratings by year. So you can just see this from March 2018. Saturday Night Live ratings slipped to season lows with host Sterling K. Brown. I don't even know who that guy is. Okay, I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. Maybe am I old, or is this an issue that People don't know who the hell these people are. Because last night's telecast, this is from March, of course, hosted by Emmy-winning This Is Us star. And now I know why. I mean, I've seen previews for that show, and it just seems kind of boring. And featuring musical guest James Bay, drew a 4.1 live plus same-day rating in the metered market households and a 1.7 adults 18 to 49 rating in the markets with local people meters. That was all from last week's. So still, SNL was the number one show of the night on the big four networks. So big whoop, because who gives a shit? In both metered market households and 18 to 49 in the local meter people, topping in both measures all primetime programs, including ABC's Spurs Thunder NBA coverage. So this is from March. So they're saying SNL on Saturday night can beat a regular season meaningless, because this is March, and basically a meaningless NBA game. That's the state that we're in. So yes, the Emmys, as a result of the suffering of actual of actual mainstays like Saturday Night Live, which in my lifetime in the 90s was a massive hit. You had there was a Jimmy Fallon era. I wasn't really a fan of Jimmy Fallon, but a lot of people were, and he had a very long run on that network, on that show. I mean, that. But in my day, there was Colin Quinn had a good run on SNL. I know I'm speaking of Weekend Update hosts, but I mean, look, there was Daryl Hammond, Will Ferrell. There was Norm Macdonald, one of my personal favorite comedians. Chris Rock was on SNL. There was, who else? There were a lot of people. Dan Hartman, Chris Farley. There was Horatio Sands. There were a lot of good people on SNL for many years. And nowadays, it's really kind of a shadow of itself. What about ESPN? They have this show that they created out of, this Frankenstein show with Mike Greenberg and Michelle Beadle, who's been paid to leave the show, and Jalen Rose, and nobody watches it. And ESPN as a whole is just kind of a hollowed out shell of its former self. So basically, you just see these groups that are or these genres that are kind of strangling themselves to death. They're like the boa constrictor that tied itself into knots. So we've already talked about a couple of them. So there's the sports networks that talk a little too much about politics, and then they get into they want to be a sports, politics, and entertainment network. You're not going to necessarily get everybody to you're going to alienate at least one of those categories, if not more than one, of the viewers, and then you're going to be left with a rumpun of an audience. ESPN has recognized the original trio of Greenberg, Beadle, and Rose had little chemistry, sources said. An unhappy Beadle recently left the show, torching the sport of football on her way out the door. Oh, really? Beadle declared she disliked Patriots quarterback Tom Brady because he had a Donald Trump Make America Great Again hat in his locker 3 years ago. As first reported by The Big Lead, Beadle also raised eyebrows by openly stating she was boycotting pro and college football telecasts for the second consecutive year because the sport doesn't respect women or people of color. ESPN owns so this is a person who's nobody cares what Michelle Beadle thinks about sports because she's not an athlete, and the only reason that she's has a job is to comment on sports. If she wants to comment on anything else, literally anything else, nobody is preventing her from going and getting a job at CNN or at E or at whatever other network you want to talk about, Sci-Fi. She can talk all day about Sharknadoes and friggin', stupid sci-fi films or whatever. Or good ones. I don't know what they have on that network. But she is hired on ESPN to talk sports, and she's trashing it? No, that's a recipe for disaster. So that's one. And then there's the Emmys. The Emmys are suffering as a result of the entertainment industry diversifying way too much, diversifying in terms of content. Okay, they were talking a lot about diversity this year in terms of racial and I guess gender makeup, but that has nothing. The Emmys have always had diversity. it's bullshit to say that. Finally we have friggin' Samoan mountain climber finally nominated, or whatever the hell they would say. No, nobody cares. Okay, if the show is not really appreciated by the viewers and wins an award accordingly, people are not going to care. So people don't care about the Emmys. And when you have people hosting the show from Saturday Night Live, which itself has seen much better days, then again, more people are going to kind of tune out and say, well, this isn't very interesting. And then, of course, Michael Moore with the tired old stunts. Nobody really thinks that this is a new groundbreaking form of filmmaking or documentaries, because it's the same guy pulling the same bullshit and going, pretending, oh, I'm the little guy from Flint or whatever. Nobody's deceived by that anymore. People know where you've been over the past 20 years, and they know you're not really true to yourself. And we're done. We're done. Like, anybody can make a documentary film nowadays. Your own success has proven that you don't necessarily need a big budget. So people are doing better films than you, Michael Moore, for much less money and making points while compromising a lot less on the actual journalistic principles that go with the craft. So that's about it. Please like the video, share the video, subscribe to this channel, subscribe to Razor Ray Live Wounds, which is my other live channel, and comment when this uploads. And let me know what you think. If you saw the movie, if you are a fan of Michael Moore's, or to the contrary, if you don't like him, and let me know what you think. And have a great Wednesday.